This is part 2 of the patterns every chess player needs to know video series. We continue today with basic tactics. In front of you, you can see the list of 15 that I made for this two-part introduction to the basic tactical patterns everyone needs to know. You'll see that the 12 we have not done are italicized there, and we are going to be moving on full steam and discussing all these patterns. Let's move on to our fourth pattern, which is the discovery tactics or discovered attacks, whatever you want to call it. Get excited. A discovery tactic can be a check or not, but it involves the act of moving one piece and then unleashing a piece behind it for an attack. This is a very commonly used one, a very famous one to highlight a discovered check with the rook moving to c6, check on the king. That black king has to move to one of these squares, either b8 or d8, and when it does, we move our knight, unleashing a check, and of course the queen would love to capture here on c6 and now undefended rook, but since the king is more valuable, once that king finds a safe square, we take on c3. So you see that the unleashing of the rook to attack the queen would not be possible without this knight attacking the king, right? Any other square for the knight, maybe besides this one, which was also check, any other square would simply allow the black queen to capture the rook. So very important that you see that a discovery tactic, the act of moving one piece to unleash the attack of another piece, works best when it's a double attack. You're attacking one piece and unleashing another. So here we're already, that's why we spent so much time on the first three ones, because you will already start to see patterns repeating. So technically that's a double attack, right? Attacking one piece and another. But it's done so in a discovery fashion, a discovered check. You move a piece to give check, and you unleash or discover another piece attacking the black queen. Quickly, we move on to number 6, which is the most powerful type of discovered double attack, and that is the double check. One thing to note about a double check is that it is the only move in chess that forces the king to move 100% of the time. So it is therefore the most powerful type of move you can ever make. By definition, when you play a double check, even if both of your pieces are under fire, and even other threats exist for your opponent, the fact that he's in check twice, and it's only possible via a discovery tactic, means that the king must find safety before he can do any of that. Here's an example where the knight takes f6 with check, not only once, but twice. Note, of course, that the knight is completely capturable, but he can't do it as long as the rook is capturing it. He would also like perhaps to give this back rank checkmate here, but he can't do that as long as he's in double check. So we see that this double check here, noted should be that this one is not nearly as good for the future of the position as black can simply move. Not really the theme here, here we're just trying to show the double check. But I do want to point out that this is the best one. We move with a discovered double check. The king has to find safety on either h8 or f8, and either one is met with rook to g8, checkmate. So again, we see the most powerful type of move in chess, that is a discovered double check. A double check is the most powerful type of move in chess. Before we move on away from the discoveries and the double attacks, numbers 5 and 6, we'll show you one discovery that is not necessarily designed to either checkmate or even win a large amount of material, but rather use just the basic fashion of what a discovery tactic can do. Here we see this position, where white is actually currently down material, but can use a sacrifice discovery to not only win some of the material back, but eventually end up ahead. Black's queen on d8 is sitting pretty as long as he can maintain it and maintain his large material advantage in doing so, but white has this discovery, knight to g6. Notice here it is also technically a discovered check. We're moving a piece and giving a check. So it has to be a discovered check, but the actual discovery tactic that matters is the bishop attacking the queen. It's called a discovery sacrifice. You're actually sacrificing the piece that is moving in order to give the check, because in doing so, you end up using the discovery tactic to win something much more valuable. So this is a discovery sacrifice, moving with check, capturing the queen, and after black captures back, white suddenly ends up this combination ahead of piece. So we've seen a discovery tactic work in a couple different ways, and we've seen double check involved. Now remember, there are many more examples we can do here, and as we build on, there will be more and more. This is just to introduce you to the concepts. Let's move on to the decoy and deflection, also known as brother tactics, in my opinion, very closely related, very similar, like the pin and the skewer, and we're going to see examples of the decoy and deflection right now. A decoy, by definition, is attracting a piece. You're sort of seducing a piece to come to a square to execute a tactic that otherwise would not be possible if that piece was not on that square. So by a decoy, we're bringing a piece to a square to execute something that otherwise wouldn't be possible unless that piece went to that square. Whereas a deflection is a tactic where you're actually distracting a piece. You're taking it away from a certain threat or a certain purpose that it's currently serving in order to execute a tactic. So I'm gonna clarify that for you here. I actually had a member correct me about that and say like, well, you've got decoy and deflection confused, and I kind of learned that, well, obviously it doesn't really matter because as long as I know the patterns, I can execute them in games, but just the semantics, the language of the tactics is defined as that. So again, a decoy is kind of like an attraction. I've also heard it called an attraction tactic. You're attracting a piece to a square, you're decoying the piece to the square, because if it wasn't decoyed there, you wouldn't be able to execute your idea. Whereas a deflection, you're deflecting a piece away from serving a purpose. So in this case, black executes a decoy tactic by playing this beautiful move, rook to h1 check. When the rook comes to h1, we see that either the knight is decoyed from its square or the king is decoyed. Well, what purpose does that serve? If the knight moves, immediately we see that the queen and bishop are now working together to gang up on the g2 pawn and thus deliver a checkmate. If the king takes it, we've now decoyed that king and attracted it onto the long diagonal so that we can play this move, queen to h3 check, very similar to a tactic you've already seen earlier in the video, in the pin example. And when this king moves, as obviously this is not legal, we will capture on g2 once again. Notice that, again, we're seeing patterns repeat. As you start to learn more tactics, by definition, you end up seeing those big three, the basics, repeat themselves. So here we see the decoy tactic, rook h1 sacrifice. If the king takes it, the queen inches her way toward g2 because of the pin, and if the knight takes us, we see checkmate here. Now let's see an example of a deflection. Here we see black execute this deflection idea with the great move, queen to b2. Exclamaviach, if you want to go with my way, right? My way or the highway. That's how we roll here on chess.com. Anyway, we're deflecting the queen away from the defense of the back rank. So here we see the deflection works not just from taking a piece away from another piece. If the queen is to capture b2, rook to d1 is checkmate right away. This combination has kind of a tricky finish. If the queen moves to e1, again, we see a tactic executed with this move, queen takes c3, which is actually also following under the category of overloading. You'll see that since that's our next one, we're actually going to classify this as number 8 too, and kind of crunch our ones together. The queen is overloaded here with the defense of the rook and the back rank, and so we can punish her for that by capturing this rook on c3. The queen would have to take it, or be down a rook, and in doing so, she's leaving the back rank behind. So this combination is a deflection tactic. We're deflecting the queen away, but it's also an overloading tactic because you're taking advantage of the queen's many responsibilities, having to guard the back rank and the rook at the same time. Black's last chance is a desperado tactic, which we're also seeing here, which is the idea of trying to sacrifice things in order to we'll get to the desperado later, we'll give it more definition, but trying to play this crazy move, hoping that black will simply capture the rook, allowing us to take the undefended queen and still guard the back rank. However, once this rook has put himself in harm's way, black can simply give check and trade queens and only again capture on c8. Noted should be, so that I don't have to deal with many comments from members, that this move immediately check doesn't work, as I can just block, and of course coming down to pin the queen to the king wouldn't work due to your own exposed back rank. So again, here we see an example of the deflection tactic working versus the decoy. Decoy, we were putting a piece on a square to execute a tactic against that particular piece normally. A deflection is one where you're taking a piece away from serving a particular purpose, often a defensive one. You're sort of deflecting it away from its responsibilities. This next example here is the best one I could come up with that really shows the brother relationship between the decoy and the deflection, like the pin and the skewer, because in my opinion, it's essentially both tactics wrapped into one. And that, of course, is this position here. In this position, of course, white would like to queen this pawn, but as long as the black queen remains in the diagonal, the piece is pinned. Moving the king to any one of these squares would simply allow a check, and probably we'd end up repeating the same type of position. However, white has the brilliant queen to b1 double exclamaviach, sacrificing the queen in order to deflect this piece away from the diagonal. But notice that though it's a deflection tactic because we're deflecting it away from serving a particular purpose, it also has to be a decoy tactic because the entire combination of sacrificing a queen would not work unless we could promote our queen and immediately apply a skewer to win the queen behind it. So notice how all these tactics are intertwined. This would be just a deflection to deflect the queen away from a purpose, but if we weren't also decoying the queen to this critical square, then the next move of skewering it would be useless. If the queen were on, let's say, some other random square like d2, all that would be doing is a check, and the king would simply find safety, likely leading to a draw. But in this case, we've deflected the queen from a purpose and decoyed it to the square that allows us to win by promoting our pawn. So we see the decoy and deflection very intertwined. To show an example of removal of the defender, which, by the way, is also perhaps another theme we could have applied to the last one that I used for overloading and deflection, where the queen couldn't guard the back rank and the rook on c3. You can back up the video and check that out. That could also be a removal of the defender because we're removing the queen from the back rank. But here we'll do another example of removal of the defender. We recognize the potential for a fork, a tactical possibility on e6, but that doesn't work as long as there's a pawn there. So we remove the defender and therefore execute a tactic. This particular position, the material count on the board is not that relevant. I was simply trying to highlight the theme itself, removing the defender of a particular idea, and then we can execute that idea as soon as we remove that defender. Another very common one that we've seen is something like this. Again, not necessarily to give a position that's really that practical, but just to highlight the principle that removal of the defender is often a very direct tactic. Like the last one, we're directly removing a defender to execute something immediately. Otherwise, it's probably classified under something more advanced. Here we have a direct threat of checkmating on g7, but there's one defender, and that, of course, is the knight on e8. After taking it, we can execute this back rank, this checkmate on g7. The rook had to take it because otherwise he was back rank checkmated, and the game is over. So we see a very simple example, two simple examples of removal of the defender. To highlight the concept of interference, I'm going to use this example here. White first starts out with this check on f7. Pretty easy and simple, and not really the major point of this tactic, so we'll just move it. And now White recognizes the potentially weak back rank, as well as the let's say, bad communication between all of Black's pieces in terms of guarding that weakness. So White plays an interference move. It's also been called as a guerrilla tactic because often interference moves are temporary sacrifices. It's hard to call it a sacrifice if it's part of a bigger combination that simply wins the game, right? How can we really call it a sacrifice if that's the case? But in this case, White plays this move, bishop to e8, cutting the communication off between the rook and the bishop as interference, like a guerrilla warfare, smoke and mirrors, just simply confusing your opponent. The problem is that even winning this piece has now opened up the possibility for White to sacrifice and deliver checkmate along the back rank. Any other move to make the same sort of threat would not be nearly as effective, as the black queen can simply come over and guard the bishop, or perhaps even a pawn move might be good enough, as taking here would no longer be very useful. So we see that the interference idea of placing your piece in between the communication of your opponent's pieces was critical in terms of executing against black's back rank weakness. One more example of interference, this move bishop to d3 here for black is the only winning move, and it is a great one, placing itself in between the communication of all of these pieces in terms of guarding a couple important things, one being the back rank and one being the overextended rook on d6. Without this tactic, taking advantage of either one would be impossible, as obviously giving check would allow this move bishop f1, and taking the rook is certainly not possible as long as it's defended. So playing the move bishop to d3 forces white to make a choice. Take with the bishop and allow the rook to fall, or take with either rook and cut off the communication of the bishop and the queen on this critical f1 square and allow this move rook to e1. Hopefully this should highlight for you once again the power of an interference tactic, creating bad communication between your opponent's pieces. Let's talk about an X-ray tactic, which can be seen 100% clearly from this example here. In this famous type of X-ray tactic, white is trying to take advantage of black's weak back rank as well as execute the power of his own passed pawn. After the move rook to c8, simply threatening to capture the rook and give checkmate, black has serious issues. The only move is to play rook takes rook takes c8, which allows a further deflection with this move queen to e7. In this case, queen takes e7 would allow d takes c8 queen, so I guess we're classifying that under deflection. Any other move with the rook will allow me to queen, where I'm now playing with two queens versus your one, or back rank checkmating you. The X-ray tactic is seen clearly after black tries to take the pawn on d7 with the queen. which of course would probably be the most obvious response for a player expecting to be able to eliminate this pawn and thinking that he's also defending the rook on d8, preventing back rank checkmate. However, now white executes an X-ray in high fashion with the move queen to f8 check. We see it's an X-ray because our pieces are communicating through one of our opponents. You can see when you click on the article link to the definitions and example, you'll see a couple more great examples of an X-ray. Basically, the key is when your pieces are communicating through one of the enemy pieces to deliver something powerful. In this case, a back rank checkmate. Black must capture the rook, the queen on f8 with the rook, and after rook takes f8, Ouchtown, Smashville, population black king. In this case, once again, we see it, rook to c8. If takes, a deflection tactic is executed trying to deflect the queen away from this winning idea or creating a second first lady. After the most logical response, we see an X-ray tactic executed in high fashion with our pieces communicating between the enemy and highlighting for us exactly what an X-ray tactic is. Quickly, we see kind of a made-up and not so practical example of a clearance sacrifice, with it also being very similar to the diagram given in the definitions and examples article. White simply sacrifices this rook, clearing the diagonal for the queen and bishop to execute a checkmate. So it's a clearance sacrifice because you sacrificed a piece in order to clear the way for others, right? Kind of like a reverse discovery, right? You're making a discovery idea for these other pieces that otherwise wouldn't be there without this clearance sacrifice. And normally clearance sacrifices come as very forcing moves, as trying to make another move to clear the way, let's say for your queen and bishop, would fail. This move would fail, for example, to this checkmate, and a move like this, also not check, would fail to checkmate. So a clearance sacrifice typically is a very, very forcing move. Another clearance sacrifice that's a personal favorite of my own is seen here, with black playing queen takes e3, double exclam, sacrificing the queen for a pawn in order to clear the second rank for the rooks to do their dirty. After Chekaruski, Chekarusi, and Chekalina Lashlamba, we see the white king meeting his end. In this case, of course, the pawn does not have to capture back the queen, so it's not as forcing as our last example of a clearance sacrifice. But if the queen is not captured, we see the position is just as winning for black, with threats of capturing on f2 coming very quickly and the bishop on e5 hanging. A move like bishop f4, trying to double attack the queen here and perhaps skewer it to the rook, fails to the same type of idea we just saw with black saying he doesn't care about the loss of the queen as long as he can execute this checkmate along the second rank. So this queen takes e3 is a really great example of a clearance sacrifice, clearing the way for other pieces to do their dirty work. Because we give two really great examples in the definitions and examples article that, again, you can check out, here we're just going to do one quick one from a famous game between Petrosian and Fischer, with Bobby Fischer being black. We see that currently black is down a pawn and would remain so if he simply captures this seemingly hanging knight on e5. He will lose his own knight on h5. And what's interesting to note about that is that a Desperado tactic is like a Zwischenzug. That's why we have them sort of correlated here in our list that we made for you. They're listed differently on the definitions and examples article, and you should check out both a Desperado and a Zwischenzug to kind of see the difference. But basically, a Desperado is a move that is played when there are already obvious captures to be made in the position. There are seemingly very forcing moves, like moves that you would think that black simply has to take this knight here. But instead of taking the knight immediately, black finds the move knight takes g3, exclamaviach, winning his pawn back, forcing white to capture his knight, as a rook is more valuable than either one of them. And after doing so, black can now recapture the knight on e5 with either the pawn or the bishop. And the game Fischer took with the bishop, though he said later that he thought that this was a better positional decision for black. The point is that in this scenario, white is currently up a pawn, and without this Desperado, this sort of desperate idea, black would have remained down a pawn. And it's also referred to as a Zwischenzug because it's kind of an in-between idea. Zwischenzug is a German word for in-between. It means that the obvious idea is to take the knight. But before you take the knight, you play an in-between idea, making whether it's a Desperado or a very forcing sort of move, as you'll see in the Zwischenzug example in the article once again. Whether it's a check or another very forcing move before you make an obvious recapture, or an actual Desperado. Like in this case, we would call this a Desperado because you're giving up a piece completely, but doing so in a position where there are multiple pieces hanging. And so a Desperado tactic is a very tricky way to sometimes win material or avoid losing material or achieve another goal. And it's also referred to as a Zwischenzug because it kind of comes in between an otherwise obvious forcing series of moves. So hopefully you can see that an obvious forcing move might be to just take the knight here, but before we do, we take this pawn on g3, a Zwischenzug and a Desperado, and then we take back with either the knight. We take the knight with either the bishop or the pawn. Perhaps the most famous windmill in the history of chess is given in our definitions and examples article, the Tory game, and you can see the pattern repeated there. In this case, we'll use one that kind of curtails or plays into something we're going to cover later in our mating nets video, which is a few videos from now, but I prepared this series pretty well. Like I said, there's a ton of material. A mating net that I think is referred to as Morphy's mate, but it's one that involves the windmill. It doesn't really matter the name, but the idea is that here black captures the g2 pawn, and in this case we see this potential discovery lined up, and a windmill, like I said, is based on an earlier tactic, or what I said was that so many of these more advanced tactics are based on simplified versions. So you can already see that that's happening over and over again. So here black can move this rook anywhere and give a discovered check. Anywhere the rook moves, the bishop on e4 is going to check the king on h1. But moving to any random square would allow white to simply block the checker, and now black might even be in trouble if he's not careful about the back rank. But the most forcing way to win the position is to take this pawn on f2 and give check, and when he goes here, then you repeat the process of giving another check. Black could actually repeat this process and take several other things along the second rank. And this idea of taking pieces and then going back to the original square in order to re-line up the discovered check is what a windmill is all about. That's exactly what a windmill is relining up the discovered check over and over again. But in this case, black can simply end the game by giving any check along the g file because the f pawn is gone. And in doing so, white must simply block, and bishop takes f3 is checkmate. So this is, I believe, known as Morphy's mating net, and we'll talk about mating net patterns that you need to know down the road. But in this case, we see the windmill happen by giving this check, repeating the discovered check, and then moving the rook anywhere else. Very simple version of windmill, and once again, you can check out the Tory example in our definitions article if you want to know more about a windmill. Finally, we move on to a pattern that I don't necessarily consider a tactical pattern, but because there are so many positions that are not winnable if not for Zugzwang, I figured I had to show it as a pattern you need to know in this first video. The most basic of which is one that we give in the definitions and examples article here, which is that white must make any move with the rook along the 8th rank, and in doing so, black must resign immediately or get checkmated next move. The point is, if black could just say pass in this position forever, this among with many other endings would never be winnable. Chess thrives, or it lives on the fact that the turn must rotate. If it wasn't for the fact that the turn in chess must rotate, if players could pass, optionally whenever they chose to do so, there are hundreds of positions in chess that would actually not be winnable. So Zugzwang is based on the fact that your turn must rotate. So white can make a move here, forcing the black king to move, otherwise the white would have no way of checkmating, and white ends the game. Another very famous example of Zugzwang, since we already have that in the definitions and examples article, would be this position here. White makes the move rook to a6, putting black in a dead Zugzwang because he has a few moves, but every one of them loses. And again, there are many positions where a lot of moves lose, but Zugzwang is literally defined as if your opponent could say pass, the position would not be winning. So don't confuse it. I mean, there are many positions where, like, if your opponent is just lost and every move is going to lose, well, then they're just losing. But these are positions that if your opponent could say pass here, white would have no way to make progress. Taking the pawn doesn't help, as the rook cannot beat the king, bishop, and pawn by itself. It's theoretically impossible, and the subject of another lecture potentially. But and any other move with the rook would allow black to play the move a6 and free himself against future tactics. Sacrificing now simply wouldn't work and potentially would even lose for white. So the only move that wins is to put black in Zugzwang with this famous idea. And again, if black could say pass, he would indeed draw, but he can't say pass. If the bishop moves anywhere along this diagonal, we checkmate. And if the pawn captures the rook, we checkmate. So this position wins because black has to move, and it's a famous example of Zugzwang. So that wraps up this two-part series of the basic patterns you need to know in chess, and particularly basic tactics.